Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, let me go back to you. There's another option that is being floated in the press, which is that if Republicans cannot pass this continuing resolution that was negotiated in part by the House Freedom Caucus, maybe there's a continuing resolution that would be able to pass with Democratic votes. And remember, the Republican majority in the House is historically narrow, something like 5 votes. And so it would only take a small share of moderates to vote with every Democrat for some kind of continuing resolution that would keep the government open. Kim, do you think that there's a prospect of that happening if McCarthy and House leadership feels like they're really stuck in a corner as the October 1 date looms?
I mean, I guess it's a possibility. We're not there yet. But here's the problem there is that with that majority, remember, that very slim majority and the House speakership, the gavel for Kevin McCarthy, also came with strings attached. He had to agree to many things to the right flank in his party, including a provision that any one person can call for a motion to vacate the chair, essentially to get rid of McCarthy, to lose him his speakership. Right now, some of McCarthy's biggest critics, guys like Matt Gaetz, who's a bit of a showboater on all this, he keeps threatening to do it every other day. He hasn't because he knows he's not going to win that vote. The reality is that McCarthy maintains a lot of support and respect across all of the caucuses that he oversees. And they understand that he's in a tough spot, that he's doing his best. And, they're not going to go down the road just because of personal animosity from a guy like Matt Gaetz. But if he were to go ahead and potentially throw, for instance, the House Freedom Caucus as a whole under the bus in order to get Democratic votes to pass a CR, that might be a different scenario. So he's going to be very, very reluctant to go there. How does that pressure play out if there is a shutdown and day by day the headlines get worse and worse? I am not entirely sure. Does that move some of his more conservative members to get behind him in a more clean CR that they can pass on their own? Or does that move instead in a way that the pressure is so great that McCarthy feels like for the sake of the Republican Party, he has to get Democratic votes, even if it may lose him his job? I'm just not sure what the answer to that is yet.
But McCarthy seems to have been flexing his position a little bit recently in regard to this motion to vacate the chair. This is reporting on September 14th by NBC. In a closed-door House GOP meeting Thursday morning, Kevin McCarthy all but dared his detractors to file the motion to vacate. He told them, if you want to file the motion to vacate, then file the bleeping motion, according to 2 sources in the room. And Kate, part of the dynamic here is I think the critics of Kevin McCarthy have the same problem that they had when they were trying to avoid electing him in the first place, is that it doesn't seem like there is another candidate who can bridge the divide and get the support of some of these Main Street Republicans and also get the support of some of the Freedom Caucus Republicans in order to get the majority needed to take the speaker's gavel. And so part of his calculation might be, if you depose me, we're just going to end up with another 2 dozen ballots, and maybe I'm the only candidate who can get the election again.
Yeah, you're right. That part of his hold on power is that there really is no other alternative. One last quick thing on the point about leaning on Democratic votes to pass a CR is that you would like some of these Republicans to think next step about what that kind of CR would look like if McCarthy was forced to do that. I was just describing how the current one, for all its flaws, does impose more fiscal restraint on domestic agencies than, for instance, the Pentagon. Democrats aren't going to accept that if they have to help lend votes to a CR. So the eventual CR that leaned on Democrats is going to be further from these priorities that these Republicans say that they want. And it's going to render McCarthy a weaker speaker to accomplish anything at all. So again, I'm repeating myself, but it's just hard to overstate the extent to which this is a self-defeating exercise. But on your point about just the lack of available alternative, that is really the motion to vacate is something that may be a threat that nobody's willing to pull the trigger on because there is not a candidate who can bridge some of these competing ideological divides. One that was held up when McCarthy was struggling to get the job in the first place was Steve Scalise, But Scalise now is being treated for blood cancer, which thank God looks to be treatable. He may not be available to step in. And also, I'd add, if you remember, I guess one of the last recent parallels that we lived through was deposing Boehner and getting Paul Ryan. Well, there is no Paul Ryan in the current conference who has that cross credibility. And also, look how Republicans treated Paul Ryan over time. I really have a hard time seeing a member who has that kind of credibility even volunteering for that thankless job cleaning up after this elephant parade. So McCarthy's willingness to do it and the lack of an available alternative might help him hang on. But also, there's no strategy here to anything that extracts any more conservative or Republican priorities than what exists now.
And I understand the frustration by these Republicans that more cannot be done. On Monday, the headline was the U.S. national debt tops $33 trillion for the first time. And so I get the frustration from some of these people in Congress that what are we doing here nibbling around the edges of this problem? But you have to exercise the power that you hold in a way that can get something done. And it seems like the Republicans have done that by sticking together on the debt ceiling deal under Kevin McCarthy earlier this year. And the way to make progress is to make those incremental gains and then take them to the voters in the 2024 election. And instead, we seem to be going through this cycle again, filing under lessons never learned, where Republicans are in disarray, not sticking together. We may be barreling into a government shutdown. And that will be, I think, a key argument for President Biden and also for Democratic challengers to some of these Republican incumbents, that these guys, this is the gang that can't shoot straight. They can't get the government funded. They can't get those Social Security checks out to seniors. They can't keep the national parks open. And Kim, I guess one of the things that I look to as a way to explain why we keep going through this cycle is the list of open secrets, people who get most of their campaign money from small donors. And at the top of the list are a lot of these bomb throwers: Bernie Sanders, 70%, Marjorie Taylor Greene, 68%, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, 67%. There we are, Matt Gaetz, number 4, 62%. And it is easy, I think, to vote no on something and go on Twitter and say, look, the national debt hit $33 trillion for the first time, and I voted no on this government funding deal that doesn't do enough to solve the problem, and try to make it an issue that can raise some campaign dollars for you that way. Unfortunately, that actually doesn't do anything to solve the problem.
Right. I mean, what have you contributed to the debate lately other than going on TV, other than campaigning for yourself and getting yourself in the headlines because you're the person who said no? I mean, the entire history of politics in Washington shows the same lesson over and over, that when a party sticks together, that when a party is unified, that's when it has the leverage to accomplish things. And, we've seen that in the most recent history of Republicans. Look, Kevin McCarthy won a decent outcome with this debt ceiling deal because he managed to get all the members of his party to vote for it and stay united when everyone said that he wasn't going to be able to do that. Now, I understand that there is still bitterness from people on the right that deal didn't go even farther. But again, they only have one house in Congress, one part of Congress. They don't get to call all the shots in Washington. And, I think the other frustration from some people who are out there watching and that are more pragmatic about this is, all this discussion about how we need to do something about 33 trillion debt. I totally agree. But maybe everyone can acknowledge the reality too that 8% in discretionary, non-defense discretionary spending in a bill is not going to get us there until the Republican Party, by the way, decides to have an honest and serious discussion about how they're going to reform entitlements, how they're going to change the mandatory portion of the spending. We are nibbling around the edges. And so how much damage do you actually want to do to yourself as a brand going into a presidential election in order to nibble around the edges?
But I think those kind of incremental gains can be a first step. And I will point back to the Journal's editorial on the debt ceiling deal in May, when it was unveiled. It says the domestic discretionary cap will rise in fiscal 2025 by a 1% increase. And Kate, the other thing to keep in mind is the inflation rate. If you have a 1% increase in spending, with inflation that is running at 3 or 4 or 5% or higher, that is a real cut in spending. And I know that's a point that can get lost in some of the arcana of these spending debates in Congress. But I think that's a step forward, even if it's not going to solve the problem entirely in one fell swoop, as some of these Republicans seem to want to do.
Right. I mean, and you do the same thing with some discrete policy priorities some of these appropriations bills have in them. The continuing resolution now tries to move some pieces of the agenda on the border for the GOP, and you don't get all of them, but maybe you pick a couple spots. Same thing with the Pentagon, trying to defund some positions focused on climate change or equity initiatives that are progressive agenda items. There are places where you can extract improvements. And the other thing I'd add is that Republicans have been campaigning and talking about regular order and dysfunction in Washington for a very long time. And they have been saying omnibus bills where you just jam through all the government spending late one night, usually before a holiday, are a terrible way to run a government. And getting off of those would be a tremendous achievement by itself that would also lend itself over time to embed more spending extractions, because you get to have those discrete debates and look under the hood of agencies and say, well, this agency can't justify having, an increase in this regard, instead of jamming them all together. So even that alone, I think Republicans are sometimes short-sighted to now get bogged down and say, well, it's not enough, and spending cuts, when really there is, I think, political ground to be gained on getting Congress to be functional again. And that is apparently an accomplishment that we're going to still have to wait some time for.
Thank you, Kate and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.